Hello and welcome back to the Betarians podcast. It is I yet again. I've immediately forgotten what I was going to say in this podcast. Welcome to the podcast of the Betarians, as we always usually talk about tropes, superpowers, special abilities in fiction and games. As I've said many times before, I am the main developer of the Animite Tales, as I've just now gotten one of our main logos on there right now. You can check us out on Twitter, or we have a Facebook page, and we also obviously have our YouTube channel. We do podcasts every week, just so that then people then can just hear us talking about different things. But we usually just talk about bits and pieces that sort of have inspired us to either make new characters on tabletop RPGs, write stories, or even build things for the game itself. I'm accompanied with two of my playtesters today. As Sam stepped into a portal last week, he said that he was going to see us in the future. I don't know. I mean, it's the future now, but I don't really know what happened to him. But either way, we have Obscuricon, aka Alex,
Hello?
and we have Daddy Mothmaster, aka Alfie.
Hello, children.
And today we've got a special little thing. So last week we talked about time manipulation, but this week, what have we got for us, Alfie?
This week we have Spatiale, everything spatial, distortions and portals.
Oh, okay. So I guess like an example of this power would be best. So like, the power to manipulate space.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So it's a bit like Portal, the game. If anyone out there has not played it, or if you've been living under a rock for the past sort of decade or so, Portal is an amazing game about portals where you have a gun that can make like two that are linked, and it's kind of a puzzle game based on that. So that's kind of part of it. There's also the aspects of it that are more related to characters like Doctor Manhattan from Watchmen, where it's more about sort of messing with sort of the fabric of things at an atomic level as well. Using your abilities to essentially reassemble and restructure space or anything made of atoms.
I mean, one of the main abilities that we've done here is obviously last time we were talking about time manipulation, like the literal
Hmm.
ability to manipulate the fabric of time. This one is space. Now, space can obviously be considered as space, as in like what's out there past planet Earth, or whatever planet you're from, and it's that concept of like it's the vastness of space. But actually, spatial manipulation is not actually just like cosmic. It's actually more like the actual concept of there's a space between you and me, like say for instance a 10-meter space between you and me. If you can manipulate just the literal concept of the space, like close it up or manipulate it so it's wider, or even shuffle it around, the space that you're occupying is basically one of the more interesting things. To bend space around you, you can actually technically control a level of reality.
It's kind of a
Absolutely.
hard power to wrap your head around, really. I mean, even more difficult than like time manipulation because we still have a concept of like beginning, middle, and end with time, and it's just like, oh well, we'll go to that point in time or that point, or it's a different dimension in which the different timelines occurred. To actually think about, space like closing the gap and stuff, it's sort of like it can mess around with our human brains. It's like optical illusions almost. It's like even like basic stuff like depth perception and stuff can be like whoa with people. So to actually have like the power to make these things a physical reality, like actually closing the gap between things that shouldn't be together, or spreading them apart, or creating like a door to like a completely different set of the room that doesn't exist, or like creating your own pocket dimension, outside of like the physical space. It's just sort of like, I don't know, my eyes are going cross-eyed now that I'm talking about this. It's like,
I mean, it is really one of those powers where there's a level of, as you said, like an optical illusion almost. Like there's a level of that, but with imagine like on a much larger scale, like a literal cosmic, if not a reality level scale, where say for instance, like in certain games you have it like with the portal gun, as you said in Portal, you create like this energy barrier on one object, and you create another energy barrier on another, and they create some kind of like basically the two portals link together through the dimensions, so it's literally a doorway to another location. And it's like, imagine if you had a door in your front house, but it actually took you to the upstairs instantaneously. And it's like,
Oh,
that level of stuff, like a portal from, let's say for instance, above you to below you, you can infinitely fall. But although that is like really cool, like the infinite fall jump thing, that's only one small, tiny ability, a tiny effect of how space can be manipulated. Like the fact that you can do the infinite corridor, where you can just keep walking forward, or the fact that you can place it on the ground and then place it on the moon, and then like obviously because they're on two atmospheres, the atmosphere either ruptures through the portal or starts pulling everything into that portal. So it really just depends on where you can put it on or what you can do it to. And that's only just portals itself. But yeah, do you have any other possible examples, Alfie? Because I know that you've got a Warhammer reference in you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, as far as Warhammer goes, I may as well get straight into it because I've got Warhammer and JoJo. Really, they're kind of my two
I
things.
knew it. I knew it. You were
Hey.
going to go for JoJo as well. I was just waiting. I was just on the edge of my seat. It's like he's going to mention JoJo. He's going to mention JoJo.
He's absolutely gonna mention
I know who
JoJo.
he's going to mention.
Or I'll do a reverse. JoJo first. A couple of examples that spring to mind. There is D4C, or Dirty Deeds Done a Dirty Cheap, which is the stand of Funny Valentine from part 7 of JoJo. And his stand ability allows him to essentially create a portal to an alternate dimension, or any alternate dimension that he wants, between two objects. So there's a few sort of examples of that, like within JoJo, where he kind of opens a door, and then the gap between his door, and the wall, you can open up to any alternate reality. So essentially, that's an example of kind of using portals in a.
Isn't that more time manipulation? Because he literally is opening up to an alternate dimension, but it's another timeline.
It's kind of an intersection between time and space, really, because it's like it's another timeline, but it's still happening alongside our current timeline.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've always thought that's kind of it's using portal and time manipulation, I guess, together to
Yeah.
kind of like join from last week. But yeah, there are lots of different examples in JoJo as well, like with Sea Moon and his stand there that it then evolves into, which is like Made in Heaven. So you can kind of, with Sea Moon, you can control gravity manipulation there and kind of bend the space around himself to essentially make it so that you can either like walk on walls or float, or make things kind of float around him, and essentially use a form of kind of telekinesis in a way by manipulating the space around him. And then when his stand then evolves, he can essentially move space kind of like forward and back by like bending it in on itself, kind of distorting time as well, as they're both kind of inextricably linked. Like the more I kind of like think about all the examples that I've seen using sort of spatial abilities and things like that, that they're quite intertwined with time as well, as space and time are kind of relative.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Okuyasu.
Oh, there's a hand up.
Yes.
The hand.
Alex is pulling out the references now.
On fire.
No, I'm just thinking that's more like sort of not. We're talking about like not necessarily linked to time, like purely a spatial ability. That would be
Yes.
one of them.
I
Yeah.
personally love that one, and I'm so glad that you bring that up, because the ability to for those who don't watch JoJo and don't actually understand it, in the actual series, there's a guy who has a special ability where his hand can create this scrape in space. It then deletes it or removes it from reality, and then obviously if that space is removed, space has to then close up, so then it closes up the gap. Either if it only sucks away the air, that amount of air is then deleted from space. He uses that at one point on a fence, and the fence gets shorter because that fence is no longer that piece of space that was occupying is no longer there, so therefore it's gone. And you can actually use it to teleport. You can do all sorts of different things with it, and there's so many incredible things that you could use that power for. But at the same time, it's also a really dangerous power because it can just one-hit kill anything if it was to be used that way.
Shame Okuyasu is such an idiot. Like,
Yeah,
he was
I love it. That's like one of my favorite quotes of all time. Not just in Jump to say, a stand that erases space and teleports objects. That could have been really dangerous if this guy wasn't such a dumbass.
Yeah, the amount of stuff that he uses it for though is ridiculous. But like his sort of applications of it are insane. And
I
then
kind
like
of like that though.
yeah, and then like an even more powered version of that is the one from part 3, which is Vanilla Ice's stand Cream,
Yes.
where he can sort of like create a pocket dimension inside himself that he can pilot the stand and essentially kind of blip out of our reality and kind of move around it without sort of like being seen or hit. But then he can sort of pop back in and delete anything that he devours, kind of like a moving black hole.
The stand itself can seem to eat anything, and once it consumes anything, it basically is just deleted. Like it's just entirely gone into another dimension. However, it seems as though he can be eaten by his stand and not ever be harmed or affected by the damage of the stand if he chooses not to, which is kind of an interesting thing because he then creates a bubble of consuming space that it constantly eats up. It eats up things because it's literally just sending them instantly into the void, never to be returned. Whether it's just the fact that they are actually deleting the physical object, or if it's actually it's just being sucked into that dimension, we are never given an explanation on Cream's actual origin or even end goal of that ability. We just know that it's a really overpowered stand.
Yeah, like most of the stands in there in that part, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, there's those examples in sort of like a lot of popular media there, and also flipping on to Warhammer as well. The entirety of Chaos as a faction within Warhammer is related to space. As in 40k, there's a kind of a element which is kind of seen as sorcery, but it's more kind of based on psychic powers, and they are allowing sort of like various people who have psychic potential to kind of do almost anything really with their powers. And on the surface, it kind of looks almost like magic, but it actually comes from a alternate reality to our reality that mirrors ourselves, in which basically all sort of emotions and anything that constitutes kind of psychic energy gets made sort of manifest in this other dimension called the Empyrean, which is basically where the Chaos Gods lie. And the Chaos Gods are purely predicated on, arguably, there's 4 of them. The 4 main ones are kind of predicated on the 4 main aspects of human existence, being that there's Khorne, which is the god of like blood and anger and sort of warfare and violence, and then there's Slanesh, which is the god of sort of like debauchery, lust, and like kind of excess in all forms and gluttony. Then there's the god Nurgle, which is the god of entropy and decay and kind of inevitability. And then there's my personal favorite, Zinch, which is the god of change and lies and manipulation and knowledge as well. So he's kind of very much based on bending the fabric of reality and changing things at a fundamental level. As one of his most signature abilities that like most of his sort of followers has is the ability to change people on a fundamental sort of like structural level, change them either via mutating them horribly, giving them sort of gifts that are making them sort of like faster, stronger, smarter, pulling in information from sort of like realms beyond ours, and sort of like sometimes just bringing in pure sort of like elements of the god itself into our reality to sort of possess people as demons. So basically, that entire faction is predicated on spatial abilities with this kind of mirror version of our universe.
It's funny you should mention that because I've got a note here from Sam.
Oh yeah.
It's just scrawled on a little piece of paper that's just fallen from the sky. I don't know
Oh,
if
it's
that had
appeared
any
on your
meaning.
desk.
Yeah, and it said mention the Greek myths and and it just popped into my head, like we're talking about like godlike powers. Like spatial is sort of an inherently godlike power because you have like total control over the physical reality, and maybe that's like where it originated from. This sort of fascination with it, and like why we consider it OP, and big well because it is OP. You could literally just delete entire worlds like that.
Yeah.
Just copy,
Or send them to
cut
another
paste delete.
dimension. So it's
Yeah,
like it seems
exactly.
like deleting in our universe, but it's actually just you're sending them to another place or another plane.
And you haven't really, done anything like, I mean, especially if you don't consider it with time, you know, if you don't use it with time powers,
Mm.
you technically haven't, done too much. You've just sort of like transported one bit of space to another bit of space. So you
Yeah.
have actually fundamentally changed the fabric of reality, but you still haven't technically changed it. Like you've done this huge, thing that has, implications for the entire universe, but you've also just like it's just cut paste
It
in a
could be
different
Yeah.
either something
location.
really overpowered, or it can actually just be considered as something silly and goofy, kind of like
Exactly.
a weirder version of telekinesis, like a more weird way of going around it. Like the difference between someone who can control blood and a person who can actually control all of the biological matter in a person's body. It's like
Yeah.
literally like, oh, I can control your blood, so I can make you move around. Yeah, I can literally just control every part of you that is biological, including your organs and stuff. And then obviously then you have just an actual telekinetic, and it's like, oh, I guess you could do that, I guess, if you wanna be really specific about it. I mean, the best one that I actually have is we were talking about portals, and yes, you can actually using space manipulate reality. Like for instance, you could bend an entire bus to go like just entirely make a U bend, and all you're doing is just bending the space. So you're not actually physically harming something, but you're actually altering the space that it's occupying, or at least
Mm.
altering how it's occupying that space. So you can actually obviously manipulate space for an entire building to just bend sideways, but it's still operating in the same level of gravity. Because you're not altering gravity, you're altering the space that it's occupying. But even so, you could then actually create if you actually could somehow create a projectile of space that can actually choose and select what type of things that it can pass through. Like for instance, again making another JoJo's reference, but then very swiftly moving on to another thing is, in JoJo's there's an actual stand that is a sword, and the sword can pass through objects, but it can slice through flesh. Now, the way that it does this is by becoming intangible to other physical objects, so that it can only cut living objects. Like it can only cut living flesh. And in doing so, that technically means that you have an incredibly powerful weapon that just bypasses defense ratings, that entirely ignores armor, and entirely ignores like concrete or steel or any other physical matter that isn't biological. And it chooses to do so because later on, I think it is actually used to cut down a pillar. But again, it chooses to do these different abilities, and it's the exact same thing with portal creation. Like you could actually create like pocket dimensions, like a dimension of space that is actually shrunken down, or another version, or a bit of space that you've actually created inside of space, like a dimension in between air particles, or a dimension inside of another plane of existence. And to do this, like to go to other realities or create your own pocket dimension, that's really good for a home base, an infinite, well, quite literally an infinite pocket, your own wardrobe, whatever, a means of transport, as we've seen before. But also one of my favourite ones is going through into other dimensions, like other pocket dimensions, alternate reality, etc. Like Betarians done dirt cheap. But the best one that I've seen so far is in the Flash CW TV series, season 4. Spoiler alert! Is there's a guy called the Folded Man. And his power is literally to be able to go in and out of dimensions. That's literally his ability. He, quote unquote, folds into another dimension. And with this ability, it means that he can literally go into a dimension that exists inside of normal reality. He can go to technically a mini universe, another reality, etc., etc. And it's technically like as if he's manipulating space itself, like the dimension that we live in and exist in, opening up a new sort of gateway to a dimension that exists outside of our current perception, and then going into that one. So it's kind of like either a dimension that is too small or too big for our current understanding. Like for instance, you would be able to live inside of an atom, or in between all of the atoms in the universe. And it's really trippy, and it makes you sort of like, why do I smell copper? Like,
my mind.
it is really spacey.
My
But
mind.
one of the reasons why I like that is just the concept of like infinite possibility for travel. Like that's one of the best ways that it can be used. So here's my question though, Alfie. Before we get into the questions,
Yeah.
I have the usual one, which is, why was it chosen? Why personally did you choose space?
I chose it because it was one of my favorite powers, and it goes very well sort of hand in hand with time. As a lot of examples that I could think of, and examples that I could see in sort of like media that I consume ravenously on a daily basis, usually shows it as being kind of interlinked, especially in sort of JoJo. Also, it's like a weird intersection because I was simultaneously replaying Portal 1 and also watching JoJo Part 4. And and I think it was also playing like Warhammer Total War like all at the same time, and it was like a perfect storm of like, I think
I think now's the time.
the universe is literally bent around like to just purely shove spatial distortion in my face, so I need to talk about it. But it's such a versatile ability with so many applications.
Oh yeah,
'Cause
so many.
you can go down the route of essentially just making yourself as like Portal Man, or you go down the route of sort of like just deleting things from existence, which is kind of similar, or you can go down the route of sort of like being a Doctor Manhattan.
I mean,
and
to
just sort
literally base it off of something. Here's three characters that are actually in modules that we've currently got working on Animite Tales. We have Jack, or aka the Leprechaun, who literally uses spatial, and people at first think that he's magic because he uses his spatial abilities to mess around with things, and then later on you get Portal Girl, who literally her main ability is to create portals and mess around with people's perception of where she is. And then finally we have Liminal, who is a character who she uses her abilities to manipulate space, mess around with it, and she even actually makes her clothing similar to a pocket dimension. So if like any projectiles are fired at her, it immediately just gets absorbed into a pocket dimension for later use. And that's exactly like the weird, wacky stuff that she can do, and the weird and wacky stuff that all of them can do. But then you've also got Animar, the supposed god of space and being, like the literal, basically, god of the physical universe and reality. And when people ever see him, they state that he looks like a creature that is a silhouette of space, like a literal silhouette of space. Like you can look into and you can see the stars and stuff like that, and you can see glowing and yet also like a void of different colors. But he is mostly a void of like looking out up into the stars, and that's exactly it. Like you've got like different concepts of how you can use powers, literally in all four of these different characters I've just mentioned. Like you can use it to create projectiles that can ignore damage resistances. You can create things that immediately are intangible. You can make portals. You can manipulate space in different ways. You can make things shrink. You can make things larger, because apparently that's how it works in Marvel. And I guess it kind of makes sense. How you can alter reality by changing how much space a thing occupies, or changing how much space occupies that thing. And being able to control that, as we've said, is like almost like practically on like deity level power. But at the same time, it can just be as silly and as wacky as, oh well, that object is no longer 10 feet away from me; it's now 1 foot away from me. Also, I just grab it. There we go. and then like reset where everything else is spatially corrected, and so everything just goes back to normal.
Yeah, just like put a portal into the fridge so you don't have to open the door and just get it,
Yeah.
and then close the portal.
And another one, which is also quite interesting, that no one's actually spoken about it, is technically My Hero Academia, because they actually have a guy currently kind of like that. The best one I can say is obviously you have Kurogiri, who actually is a warp gate guy. He's like made out of this fog that allows him to like create spatial pocket dimensions and opens up portals from one place to another. He's really good with controlling that power. But I wanted to actually talk about Gentle, as in the gentle criminal, because he can make anything elasticated, including the air. He can make things elasticated. Technically, that's by changing the spatial density of an object. Sort of similar. It's like a sort of like physical reality warping ability, where instead of like it, the space only bends this way or warps this way. It's actually the space is elasticized. So therefore, like if you actually touch this thing, it'll move and bend this way, but then immediately it'll try and fight back with elastic potential. So ultimately, again, you can. There's so many different uses and so many different ways that you can use this power. That's how I see it. Do you guys see any other ways that how it can be used?
Do you remember that time in the 8Cs where like you put someone's I think we put like one of a monster's head in a pocket dimension, and so it was sort of disabled in like our world. I mean, it was still attached, like it wasn't like severed or anything.
Spatial severance, yes. The
Yeah, it
concept
wasn't.
that it's occupying a different place of space, but because that it's spatially still connected by being disconnected, kind of like a pocket dimension has severed its head, but they are still technically they're still connected. They're just in different places in space.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of a cool thing. It's like it's a way of like disabling someone without
Killing.
like without killing them. And it's like it is kind of weird because it's one of those things again where it's like it's potentially a useless power or a very useful power because you're not killing them and they have to go somewhere. Like it's still in that pocket dimension. Like you haven't actually solved the problem. But
That
if you want to like
ability, that ability also is very similar to an ability in One Piece, where a guy actually is able to like cut people, but when he uses his special power, when he cuts them, their heads, their arms, he can cut people in half into bits. They're not dead. They're genuinely like they're not dead, and you can actually reattach them back together. And once they're done, like the magic wears off, and then they're back to normal. And that's a really cool way of doing it, like spatially severing something, so that they're still like the stomach will still be fed if the head eats. The eye will still hurt if it's poked. But
that's so scary.
the brain is the one that's recepting it, so the mouth that is miles away starts screaming out in pain. And like what's happening? There's no ears next to the mouth, so then the ears can't hear someone saying what's happening.
Isn't it's like I think that Bill Cipher from Gravity Falls has that kind of ability where it's like, okay, now all of your senses are reversed, so you
Oh,
like
he
your
goes,
eyes.
It's like, oh, we pledge servitude. Yeah, how about I just shuffle all the functions of your face, and then immediately his ears are his eyes, his nose are his ears, and his mouth is his nose. I can't remember. It was something really weird.
Yeah, it was like his ears were on the front of his face, and he couldn't talk because like his nose was actually his mouth, but he was still screaming
And
through his nose.
yeah, and his mouth
Oh.
had his eye in it. Like his mouth has his eyes out, like, hanging out of it. It's really really freakish. It's funny, but yeah, it's
A
terrifying.
show for kids.
A show for kids. I mean, technically, with biokinesis and spatial, you could technically do something weird with
Oh
that.
my gosh,
Like,
I'm getting ideas.
Because you could just manipulate the space that is occupying their face. So it's like technically they're not being harmed by this. It's just that the parts of their body are now occupying different parts of their body. Like their eyes are now on their chest, and then their ears are like all the way down to their feet, so they can only hear things on the floor.
I guess it's almost worse than hurting them, really. Like it's just sort of you've just made them
scarring them.
potentially. Yeah, you're scarred them for literally scar. Well, not really literally, because it's not. Again, how the
Mentally.
power works, it doesn't actually, because it wouldn't be any scarring tissue or anything, because it's like, okay, they were always meant to be there. It's just consistency with reality. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, my eyes are on my chest now, and my foot is outside of my ear. This is fine.
But how else do you think that it can be used as well, Alfie? Do you think that there's any other ways that you've seen spatial manipulation being used or work that you thought that's actually kind of an interesting use of it?
Well, of course, there's also Ant-Man, or the Atom from I think
DC.
it's DC. Yes. Um, yeah, they essentially use it to manipulate the size of themselves, from either sort of like very, very tiny, like Ant-Man, or very, very large, like Giant Man, his other alter ego. I think Ant-Man in Marvel's had like 5 different alter egos now that will have like the same powers. So I think he was like Giant Man, Ant Man. I think he was Yellow Jacket at some point as well. He's had like 5 different alter egos that are all just variations on turning very big and very small, and turning other objects very big or very small, as you could probably see in a Civil War for the 5 people who haven't seen that film. Where he basically like he throws, I think, was it like a water truck at somebody, and it turns out to be like an oil tanker, and it just like detonates as he turns it giant. Like he throws it at him like the size of a Hot Wheels car, and then it transforms back into its original size about halfway through the air with the same momentum.
I really like that as well. I'm glad you mentioned that. I completely forgotten about Ant-Man actually and his abilities. I feel ashamed as a Marvel fan, but it's like, yeah, it's the way. It's not just that as well. It's like he's manipulating space so that something so tiny can like have the force of like the actual,
A thing that is
full size
very,
thing.
very
Yeah.
inconsistent. It's like, oh yeah, this tank, it keeps its same density. Then why doesn't it keep its same weight? An object that would be worth 60 tons, and it's on a keychain. No, 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 no. If it's still 60 tons, it's 60 tons. Do you do you have any idea how difficult it would be to hold a keychain that would be weighing 60? That would literally just go through your hand if you picked it up and it suddenly weighed that much. If you could pick it up, which obviously you couldn't. Imagine a pencil that is literally heavier than a car. Like you just wouldn't be able to lift it. So I mean, yeah, I never liked that. I liked the concept that because of its occupying a different space, it actually has a different it keeps its density, yes, but like does it keep its weight? Does it keep its does it keep it, is it, since it's occupying a different level of space, does it mean something different? I always took it as, and this is but this is the worst thing, I had a headcanon it. I always imagined it as, well, because it's occupying a different level of space and we are occupying a larger level of space, it is the equivalent of, if we are able to be this strong and lift up something of this size, it is the equivalent of, when it turns back into its size, it will occupy that amount of space, and therefore it will be back to its original size. So in other words, something that should be 60 tons shrunk down, it's now occupying less space, and therefore it's actually less of a large object, because that to us, or to it, we are the giants that can lift it, and therefore we can lift it and move it around normally, because it actually isn't 60 tons because of the spatial difference, because that obviously to it we are larger. But again, that also still doesn't work in the same consistency. It makes sense with powers, because again, powers can be weird and wacky, but they try to explain it with science.
Nah, that was their first mistake,
and
really.
and
Don't try
It
and explain this with science.
I
It's
mean,
not going to work.
if you're going to explain something with science, go all the way. Don't half it. Like, I mean, at least with pin particles, I guess we could state that because of its shrinking down, it's also actually lifting out the weight ratio of it, because its atomic density is actually changing.
Yeah, didn't they say as well that like if Ant Man could turn sort of like even the size of an actual ant, like even when he turns into the size of essentially like a dust mote when he runs up the barrel of the gun, if he punched someone while at that size, 'cause it says that he keeps, wasn't it the same density as he was in his normal human form, but like down
Yes.
that small. That's why he could knock someone out with one punch. He could like, according to sort of thing I read a little while ago, it's like he could pretty much atomize someone with a single punch at that density.
Apparently, at that density, if he punches someone, he can straight up kill them, or because of the power of his fist, it would be the equivalent of a bullet. Therefore, it could actually blast them to pieces. And it was just like, I mean, if that's true, Wouldn't that make sense? Wouldn't the opposite then make sense? Where if he's actually larger, he'd actually have less density, and therefore, because of that, he'd actually atomize himself.
Yeah. Or try to punch someone, it's just like being hit with a giant inflatable fist.
Can't they just state that the Pym particles just alter reality and just be done with
Yeah.
it? Just
Yeah.
don't cause science. Just do the whole thing where the Pym particles alter space, and because of that, it changes the functions of normal physics. Therefore, because of that, it can then you can say whatever, rather than well, what it does is it actually changes the molecular density of this. But no. If you as soon as you do that, it then means like, okay, well, density doesn't just mean like tensile strength or anything. It also means like a lot of the time it also means weight, and because of that, he would weigh a normal human weight, which means an ant would not be able to frickin' lift his ass because he would be so heavy.
So chonky.
I mean, like, again, like, say for instance, if you weighed 6 stone, or I don't know, 150 pounds or 200 pounds or whatever amount of measurement that you weigh or something, or kilograms or whatever. If you sat on an ant, it would die instantly, whether you are the size of an ant or not. Again, putting it again, if you had, let's say, a turtle, and then you had this large steel ball that people use for shot puts, and you just place it on this turtle, it could potentially harm or kill it. And therefore, if you did the same, where a human weighs as much as a human does, but smaller, and then sits on an ant, it would just cleave the ant in half.
Crush it completely.
So So I feel like with spatial manipulation, you need to have consistency, and with powers like manipulation of space, like with actual power, the consistency is the user can manipulate it to suit their needs. Like with Doctor Strange, like they have dimensions and manipulation of space and altering perception and bending and controlling matter at will. Like, honestly, that was such a good movie. Like the special effects alone are amazing. But yeah, I'd have to say 100% without a doubt that powers are better than tech when they're trying to alter reality, because then you have the problem of how does the maths and or science work? Oh, it just does.
Don't look at it too closely. That's how it works.
Yeah, so it's just a movie. You should really just relax, to quote my favourite philosophers on the Mystery Science Theatre team.
I can't watch it. See, the thing is, I can sit down and watch a movie, and I can suspend my disbelief a lot. I mean, hell, when I was a kid, I watched Dragon Ball Evolution and enjoyed it up until the point I left the cinema and then realised that movie was absolutely terrible. I was like, there we go, movie finished. Wait a minute.
I see your Dragon Ball Z, and I raise you Pokemon, the first movie, which I absolutely adored as a child, and like it made zero freaking sense on every possible level as a movie, and I still love it.
To be fair, it's still a good movie. Like, and if we're gonna talk about spatial manipulation and Pokemon, I think we also have to state that they manipulate space multiple times. Teleportation is technically a manipulation of space and or time, because you're moving from one point in space to another, and technically with enough power or with enough, I don't know, control over it, I guess you could actually consider that technically teleportation would allow you to time travel, depending on the strain or the limitations of a power. But now we'll go into the group questions, since we've now clearly exhausted this one. But yes, any questions for Alfie?
For me.
For spatial manipulation.
Actually, I do have this question. It might be a running question, like narratives and personalities paired with this power. I mean, we talked a little bit about how speedsters are generally quite jolly and maths based, and my enemy. But what kind of things do you think are best complement spatial abilities in terms of like personality or even other powers, really?
It's going to be slightly cliched, because it's been done quite a lot, but I think usually with cliches and tropes, they've they're cliches for a reason. I think that Spatial, sometimes, like how time is portrayed, it comes with a kind of level of omnipotence as well that can kind of
Mm.
detract from the human experience. So I think that a lot of characters, especially like Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen, or like in Warhammer with Araman, and with various other characters who use various like spatial abilities that affect reality itself, because they can perceive so much, they need to sort of like step away, and it makes them seem quite stoic and unfeeling. They usually come across quite cold, I think, in a lot of media that I've seen. Not so much people who use spatial abilities, like in Portal with I think it's Lily Chen, isn't it?
Yeah,
Who
there's
used,
Chell,
Shell,
who's
that's the one. Yeah, I don't know where I got Lily Chen from. I think that's a character from Harry Potter, but it's but, yeah. Apparently she's from Shadowrunners. But yeah, don't know where that came from. Though. It sounded right in my head. But yeah, with Shell, like she's obviously a person, although she's a silent protagonist. But she's a person who uses the portal gun. But whereas people who actually have the spatial abilities as part of them, I think it usually changes them as a person quite a bit. I think it would do as well.
Animar kind of has that, in the Animite Tales. It's sort of like, well, like, I mean, and to be fair, it is a bit different because like Animar's a deity, like literally
A
in a
considered deity,
sense. So it
but
kind of
I,
has to be a considered deity. Like I know that it's supposed to be a man who's just like so incredibly overpowered. He's just considered a god, but there's a little bit of like, I mean, don't get me
well,
wrong. Animar is like one of my favorite sort of godlike beings because
I guess
they're so chill and everything. But
I guess the
it,
main
it is sort
difficulty
of this
with well, the
separation
problem
of
is
it.
I guess the main difficulty with that is first of all, neither of you two have actually met or actually seen in game, like in any of the modules, what Animar is.
Hmm.
So you guys actually haven't been able to experience what kind of characteristics he has. But the concept of a character like that is actually like the stereotype of them being godlike or like over gaudy with their powers. It really can't really help much when you haven't seen or done much with the characteristics. Like whether or not a character is or isn't a god, I don't really necessarily think that that's actually the best example. I think it should actually be more of a person who has gained that power or was born with that power
Mm.
and is still mortal but uses it and to change their personality. Like for instance, Jack in the modules, he doesn't pretend to be a god, but he does call himself the Leprechaun because he considers him this mythical being that he creates as this whole thing of like, yeah, I'm this person who can create mischievous things, and I'm very overtly lucky. And it's mostly because that no one can really see him using his spatial distortions because he's quite dexterous and he's quite good at stealth and sleight of hand. But he sometimes does fail when using his abilities because there's a comedic element of how silly he is with his powers. So he's less more power than he is more weird and wacky abilities. But I think you're absolutely right about that. Like, a character who can manipulate space definitely would be like that. Although, weirdly enough, I'd actually say the opposite. I'd actually say the opposite. I'd say that, like with speedsters, teleporters, and even time travelers, like, a level of, there's a level of omnipotence or cockiness because they believe that they can just reset things or be faster than them. I actually have to say the complete opposite. I actually have to be, they are weird, tricky, strange, like users of a power who are more like tricksters that are kind of like, haha, weird and wacky, fun time, because that almost nothing really makes sense or difference, which actually kind of more humanizes them. Because the folded man, he's a hippie who believes that being a nomad using these powers is the perfect power to be a nomad. You then see, Doctor Strange, who doesn't see himself as a god, and he actually uses these spatial abilities to help people. But he doesn't try to be seen as this really powerful wizard in front of too many people. He doesn't care about a secret identity, but he doesn't care about like showing off like Iron Man does.
Yeah.
And then you see the exact same thing with a couple of other spatial manipulators and users and stuff like that. Like they usually use their ability in smart, funny, and tricky ways just to get the job done. whether it's either through utility use or whether it's used to obviously do something very overtly around sort of beating around the bush type of combat, rather than like flat out I now change the atomic structure or even the spatial difference by 1 centimeter on every single one of your atoms, and then boom, you are now unmade. Like, it's less violent and it's more overtly weird, funny, and wacky. Like, again, like
Yeah.
going off of the Ant-Man and the Wasp thing, Ant-Man usually fights with a very interesting and also quite visually hilarious way of fighting.
Unconventional.
Unconventional, exactly. And then you also see Ghost, like, who can use intangibility, which they've confirmed is like is a form of like her spatial density is keeps on changing, so she's constantly going in and out of the current universe and the current space that she's inside of. And the exact same thing with another character from another anime. Surprise, surprise. There's a character called Toby in the Akatsuki and Naruto, and his ability is to send people into a pocket dimension or to make himself intangible. And later on,
personality, hasn't he?
yes, he has, but even better, you actually find out that the usage of that power is actually him sending his physical form into his pocket dimension, or parts of his physical form into the pocket dimension, but his visual form is still occupying the current space. So, in other words, it looks like he's actually there, but physically he's actually just in another pocket dimension. So, again, a couple of interesting ways as to how to use it.
I was going to say, actually, I have got one more that I'm kind of I'm ashamed that I didn't bring up earlier on there. Has just like come back to me. There was an old game for the GameCube, and I am a massive fan of sort of old school Lovecraftian cosmic horror shenanigans, and there are almost too many examples of spatial abilities being used throughout that entire genre to really go into.
I'm actually quite proud of you for not actually using a single Lovecraft reference yet.
I mean, it was low hanging fruit, really, for a lot of these. So many. But in the game Eternal Darkness, which is kind of heavily inspired by all of that kind of literature, the whole game essentially revolves around. There are 4 great old ones. There's one called Mantarok, which is on Earth, which is like in the center of the planet. And then there are 3 kind of like outer gods that are kind of like at war with each other. And you can kind of like the whole game is about how you avert disaster by kind of playing essentially JoJo style as an entire bloodline rather than one titular character. Some of them die, some of them don't, and you kind of pick inadvertently at the beginning of the game what the main villain or the main antagonist is going to be between out of these 3. There's one of the antagonists called Ulioth, which kind of appears. This is giant, sort of like floating brain-like jellyfish in space, and all of its powers revolve around spatial distortion abilities. And it's meant to be, it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors, where you kind of, whatever one you inadvertently pick as the main antagonist, you then have to kind of like find out more about the other elder gods and kind of pit the right ones against the one that is the antagonist. So every time you play the game, it will be different, as you'll have a different antagonist, different allies of convenience, and things like that. But Ulioth is very much about spatial distortions, and it's really effective against this other one called Turga, which is the opposite, which is essentially it embodies kind of everything that is kind of violent and natural about nature. Kind of, it's an embodiment of sort of a mixture of super strength, biomass, devastation, sort of like regenerative abilities. It's like a giant kind of non-sentient creature, whereas Ulioth is kind of always displayed as this sort of like really hyper condescending, kind of like wacky, as you say, kind of like trickster, who's very sort of like Loki in a way, but like a much more knowledgeable version. And the way it kind of beats him at the end of the game there, if you do go down that route, is essentially like Taterga will like try to sort of attack the planet, and Ulioth will essentially just make him essentially kill himself by using portals and wormholes. So like he'll stab at the earth with his giant claw, and he'll create a wormhole around his claw that then comes out behind him. So he stabs himself, and like kind of like makes a mirrored space, so it like charges a planet, but then ends up back where it was, and all this sort of stuff. Really, really cool. I highly recommend that game. even though it's quite old. And some of the sanity effects that were used in it were just incredible. There's one. Have you guys ever played Arkham Asylum, like the first Batman game?
I know of it, but I haven't actually
Yeah.
played it myself.
It's on my
So
list, unfortunately.
yeah, so I'm not
Many
going to
games I
spoil
need to
it,
play.
but Scarecrow is probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, villain from the DC universe. As I love that sort of like mental,
I mean,
sort of
you've
like
never
trickery.
mentioned it, mate, but
No,
Well,
right?
news to me.
This is all coming as a surprise, I'm sure, to all of you who, especially those who have played with me in games. But the entire the game Arkham Asylum has a lot of meta Scarecrow moments where it actually plays on the character's mind, the player's mind as much as it plays on the Batman character. But Eternal Darkness probably still has some of the best sanity effects ever, as you'll be playing the game, and if your sanity starts getting low, it starts showing up on the screen that there's a connection issue between your controller and the console, which is completely fake, and it just does it to psych you out. And then there's stuff there where you go to save the game, but if your sanity is a certain level, there's a certain chance that you go to save the game, you click on save, and it switches last minute to delete, and it comes up as deleting your entire save game, and then it
Oh.
psychs you out and restarts the game with your save game still there. And things like that keep happening throughout the game just to really mess with
so,
the player.
so it's an in-game sanity system.
Absolutely, yeah.
I
And
mean,
loads of stuff like that happens throughout the game. It's great.
I will actually have to say, at some point we will be talking about meta powers being used in games, because like meta concepts like sanity, or what was it, sanity or actual reality being changed and warped. I love that, but honestly, it's one of those things that I'd have to build up a little bit more research about it, because I know there's a couple of games that I personally like about it. But
Yeah.
there's about, like, I think there's 3 or 4, like, there's obviously Undertale, there's obviously the Arkham games, and then there's one of my favourite ones, which was it was most recently I was playing. Technically, it is always in the background of Dark Souls, but again, we won't talk about it this time. But I do have one. I do have my question, which I kind of am glad that I actually get around to talking to this about you, actually, both of you, is. Okay, so we talked about this all the way in episode 1 and 2, but we actually didn't really speak about it too much after the first couple of episodes, which is Alfie and Alex. If you were to have Spatial allied with another power, what would you put with it, and why or how would you use it?
Well, if I was going to be evil, I would take your suggestion of using biological manipulation and spatial, because, oh boy, I could really ruin someone's day and entire life just with that. Like just putting their feet in their eyes, and or like, or like having their like legs. We actually, me and Alfie did talk about this, as a possible time manipulation SPMA, where you can accidentally give someone baby legs. Like you can do that with time density, just spatial, just make their legs like a lot smaller than the rest of their body and essentially just make them fall over.
I mean, that's horrifying, but surely a fan
Well,
of
let's see it.
cosmic horror won't be coming up with anything so forthright. I'm scared now, but go on, Alfie. What would you what would you put yours with?
Oh, I honestly, I think for me personally, I mean, one of the best sort of like combos I think that you can have with spatial is spatial and teleportation, just in terms of like utility. But I personally would go for spatial and telepathy, as you have all the wonders of essentially being a scarecrow slash Mysterio, but then you have all of the real world reality bending abilities of like true cosmic horror. And I just love the idea of just sort of like someone maybe, going to attack you, or you being in a situation where you can essentially become this like uber overpowered sort of like super villain character, by shifting what is real to that person or what is actually real.
Like reality symbiotic reality telepathic abilities, like
Yeah,
literally however insane they are now being driven by these things is exactly how many more things that you can make. Like, oh no, it's a giant wall, and then they like walk through it, and then all of a sudden they go, oh no, I need to run away, bang, hit by a wall made out of actual space, and it's like,
yeah.
that would just be terrifying.
I'm also thinking as well because there was a kind of pseudo ability I came up with like ages and ages ago back when I was first sort of like throwing around character ideas, and it's an ability I do want to bring in at some point for a character, but I haven't found the right one yet. Which I'm essentially going to call what is it called? Like I think it's what gaze into the abyss or something like that. But it's basically where you create a portal in front of you of a kind of a glimpse into another dimension. Now, what you see is so horrifying, or an alternate timeline, whatever you want it to be as a character, where it's so horrifying that has a similar effect to like a gaze of a basilisk. Like it can paralyze, cause psychic damage,
Or even
and
create an insanity ailment or something.
yes, completely morally debilitate a character. Because I think it'd be really cool to have that with a warlocky style character, where you play as a spatial user or a spatial and telepathy user that's acting on behalf of a kind of great old one style patron that exists beyond the dimensions of our current space and time. And that could be almost like a when we mentioned about like apostle abilities to do with various like pseudo sort of like religious aspects, I guess, or like faith-based aspects.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a really cool ability to have there as a very high level ability where you've proven your worth to your patron so much that they will grant you a very brief glimpse either at them or a very brief glimpse at another timeline where maybe the entire world is like been burned to ashes, or another timeline where the person who you're going up against turns out that they are kind of the villain of the story, or something that you know is going to really negatively affect that person
Yeah.
and really just mess them up psychologically. I think that'd be really cool.
I think controlling people's perception of reality alongside controlling people's reality is like the biggest like mind f ever, because it's just like
It's like, what is real?
what is
What is
real,
real?
what isn't real, and the entire time anyone else looking on the outside looking in are just like, this guy is so messed up. Like, he is literally just toying with this person at this point, and they don't know what's real. And technically, even the people who know that those illusions aren't real, they don't even know what they are making real. So it's like, I don't even know what he's seeing. All I know is it's terrifying. I will say I have two. I do have
go
two.
For it, go for it.
So the first one is the obvious one: spatial and nullification. If you can nullify a person's powers in a like by hitting them with space or something like that, that's cool. Putting them in a pocket dimension where they can't use their powers, even cooler. But that's kind of a bit meh. There's two ones that are the best one: decay and space, because I actually have made a villain like that, and to be honest, in practice, super OP. The ability where, like, literally, if he hits you with this ranged attack, you then get hit by spatial damage, because it's just, it's a form of physical damage that surpasses physical damage resistances, like armor or thick skin or rock flesh or whatever, and it hurts you. But then it also then starts decaying or rusting or even, like, disintegrating, and that just adding that extra edge of, like, this could actually be a pestilent space is terrifying. But also imagine also then changing the concept, decaying space, just like Okuyasu, but having more control over it, like being able to like create a bubble, and then anything inside of that is just now gone from existence, and then again it closes up that space because that space is now gone.
Like a remote controlled version of Cream.
Yes, yeah.
You're not you can actually see.
And the second one is actually one that I have spoken to Bill about loads of times, and I genuinely wish that I could do this, which is spatial and either water or slime mimicry. To be able to make some kind of ability where you can deal out this weird like spatial and portal, multi-dimensional weirdness but also that you are a non-physical being. That, like, if someone tries to hit you, it's like, I am made out of slime or water, and therefore you cannot harm me. But even scarier, imagine if you, like, try to physically hit this person and you just get swallowed up into literally an abyss. Like, I just thought that would be really cool. It would be really terrifying. And it's like, obviously they wouldn't be immune to damage. There would be certain things that they couldn't, they definitely wouldn't be able to do. But it would just be that thing of, like, how terrifying would it be if a portal was, like, shaped like a creature, or even a creature was an actual portal, like a moving, living being was a portal itself. So I think that those two abilities could be more physically impressive rather than reality or perception warping. But I think it would literally break morale, where it's like, what can we do against something
this powerful?
This? Like, either this powerful, where it's like, if we get hit with it, we will just either take damage or we'll take an ailment instantly, or this thing literally cannot be harmed by normal, like, means. To me, I don't know. To me, it's kind of an interesting dilemma. It's kind of an interesting one.
Well, to be honest, like, going back to... Oh, sorry, Alex, go on.
No, I was thinking of another one, like a pairing would be spatial and flight, because then you could, like, literally, there would be no barriers, in your physical space, because, well, I mean, you can transport yourself, but you could literally be just levitating in the air and dropping someone already in your pocket dimension, to their deaths, for like thousands of feet above the ground, unless they have flight abilities or like some kind of, like, dermal abilities, their dermal armor abilities. They're not going to get out of that one.
Although if they do have dermal armor abilities, as we've seen, if they get dropped off from a great height, they can easily just paste anything that they encounter.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
they could be like,
Even
that would be like
missile.
a new famous duo. Like,
Oh my god! Can you imagine if you you could be a new famous duo. One of them's spatial user, the other one's dermal armor. One of them's called cannon, the other one's called ball.
Yes.
You reach terminal velocity by sending them into two portals that are spaced like an inch apart from each other. So you just see a weird blur in the air, and then you just suddenly put one of the portals in front of you and fire them like a cannon at terminal velocity.
Some people say that we talk about the changing and the shaping of reality and insanity quite a lot, but I think this is the perfect answer for, how well Animate Tales works. Too well. It works too well, because every single person wants to now make every infinite character ever.
Yes. True. It's sadly true.
Congratulations,
Anyway, I'm
you
so
have been
sorry.
broken. So the last question, of course, we always have this question, and Alfie, I will let you go first, which is, can it be, is it in, does it work in, or at least how does it work in Animate Tales?
Yes, yes, and yes. Very well, almost too well, as you said. As you guys all know from when we were all coming up with various sort of like boss-like characters from my menagerie of absolute horrors, the one beyond was a spatial user with a unique ability, kind of like Mirror Man for Flash, or Mirror Master even for Flash.
I'm annoyed that I didn't actually bring that one up, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought you would. I was surprised. So his whole thing was like he existed in a alternate dimension that was completely opposite to us, that's only accessible via mirrors. So it's great because in a sense that as long as he's inside the mirror dimension, he could harm your reflection and not be harmed at all himself, unless you have any kind of abilities that allow you to like go through that barrier. The downside being that when you destroy these mirrors, he therefore loses his ability to access that dimension. So it's a double-edged sword. As long as you've got the right place, it's amazing. But if you're just out in the open, it's not very good at all, unless you've got like a load of hand mirrors or like, I don't know, Slash's top hat or something like that. Slade's top hat, isn't it?
No, it's a
Got there.
It's Slash, I think.
Slash, maybe, who knows? But if you have some setup, that'd be absolutely amazing. But yeah, I've really had fun with that.
What about you, Alex? Do you think that it works well, or do you think that there could be something else with the current setup that we have for Spatial?
Well, I think I was actually kind of worried about this episode because I was thinking, oh, I don't really have any ideas for it. But it's like, as we found out, we've just come up with like multiple ideas just by like looking at it a bit differently. Like the powers are there. I'm like, oh well, portal creation and etc. etc. Deconstruction, etc. etc. But if you pair it with other abilities and like just have a good setup, of like where what is the parameters of this ability, then it can become really good. I think it's just I think I was kind of limiting my imagination a little bit
That's one of the
because
reasons why we do this podcast. Like, I want anyone who's listening, or even anyone who's being a part of it, to really think about all the different ways that you could actually set up a power. Because as soon as you begin this, you have a narrow mind, and then as soon as you finish it, it's like, man, there's so many ways that you can explore one power. Either pairing it with something else to kind of give it a little bit extra flavor, or even just thinking of how it could be used. Like in Flash, they have like one person who has teleportation, and teleportation is really, really kind of like meh, limited, whatever. But then it's like you watch another series and it's like, okay, yeah, teleportation's still the exact same. But one of my favorite ones is the concept of a person can teleport from any location so long as they can see it visually in live action. So in other words, like, having a spyglass or a telescope or something, being able to teleport anywhere as long as you can see it, or at least look to it. So in other words, cut off their ability of sight, or at least lower their visibility, or lower visibility around them. Suddenly they can't use their powers so easily, or at least they can't use their powers. But then it's like someone could teleport, through memory. It's the exact same thing with Spatial. Like, technically with Spatial, you don't actually have to see your opponent to be able to mess around with space around you. But we've actually come up with the limitation of, to create and manipulate spatial things, you have to either touch or manipulate or move your arms and ligaments around to create the portals. Almost like kind of like a spellcaster has to like do certain like
kind of like a
enchantments.
Doctor Strange sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah. We did that because that like it's the concept of, to create a portal, maybe you have to like in DMC slash at thin air to open reality, or take your finger and like you just draw a circle in midair like how they do in Doctor Strange. It's like either way, however you put the flavor on it, there's many different ways that you can just look at just opening a portal. And if you can have multiple different ways of opening a portal, imagine how many other different ways that you can have just a power to be used. And that's what I want to do. I always want to open people's horizons to different concepts, to powers and abilities, because then the imagination can run wild, and then you can do anything with it. Like, this isn't, as I said, this isn't just for the Anime Tales. This is also for writing. This is for role playing. This is for games, design, development, whatever. You can listen to these podcasts, listen to me mostly rabble on, and hear everything as to everyone's opinions on it, and eventually realize that anything can actually have a decent way of how you can go about it. I'd say
it all interlinks storytelling, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like, anything to do with storytelling, it intertwines quite well.
Absolutely. I would say there's only one issue that I have with this power, and it's the exact same issue that I had with the last week's power. It is a MacGuffin. It just is a MacGuffin. It is a power that is just the easy way out. It's the key to the door of every possible ending. Jack was a very interesting character up until he suddenly went, by the way, I can create a portal or a link portal or a pocket dimension and we can go into this, and then basically we're all safe. There was literally a moment where Jack said, well, I can open a pocket dimension, but when I'm inside of the pocket dimension it can't move anywhere, but I can open it up anywhere. So just bring only me, I'll have the pocket dimension with everyone in it who we need to bring with us, and you just bring me, and then when we get there I'll open the pocket dimension and everyone can pour out and we'll be fine. And that's literally how we solved 90% of the problems on Chibo Island. And then after that we also used it to solve transport issues when he used link portals from one place to another. So
I mean, Legion can do a similar thing.
Yes, although his is more calcified time in the form of an actual dimension, and that's exactly my point though. Like Legion had the ability to do it, Jack had the ability to do it, and technically Anarche at the time had the ability to do it. Like everyone had a pocket dimension ability at one point, and it was just that thing of
Yeah, it was it's too useful.
yeah.
Far too useful.
So I think it's really good. I think it's a brilliant ability. It's one of my favorite powers. I just think, everything has an upside and everything has a downside, which, again, at some point I would like to get into that, limitations and weaknesses, but I want to choose the best time to do that, and maybe maybe even get a guest star on here at some point,
Hooray.
and try and ask them about that. But who knows? I mean, we had Des. We might try and get some other people. Might try and ask around and see about that. But until then, has anyone got any other things? Alex, do you have any other ideas for next week?
Well, I've got a few. I mean, I'm thinking the theme of putting organs, in places where they shouldn't be. Maybe we should do biological manipulation.
Biological manipulation. I tell you what, let's round that one up. Healing factors or biological manipulation? Healing and biological manipulation.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Biological powers or biological special abilities. I'll figure out the title for next time. But as I said before, in the first few weeks, but I keep forgetting to mention, if anyone has any things that they want to post in the comments, if anyone actually has anything, post it in Patreon, or even post it on our comment section on YouTube, and just tell us, anything that we may have missed from this episode, and I'll try and talk about it next episode. In the first 5-10 minutes, I'll actually talk about anyone else's comments that we actually have, including maybe if we run out of subjects, people can actually just message us, post it on YouTube, and then I'll have a look at them and see what we can do, or even tweet us at Animate Tales, so you can actually find out exactly what we usually get going on, what I usually talk about, and yeah, if you tweet me any particular video ideas for podcasts, like for powers, or even just like talking about a specific subject to do with powers or something, we'll have a look at it and we'll consider it, to be fair, because I mean we don't really usually come up with things up until like the last second, and then we research throughout that entire week.
Just BBM us.
Don't tell them to do that. It doesn't exist anymore.
I'll be very impressed if anyone does manage to do it. So that's
I
would. I don't have a BlackBerry, so I mean.
Neither do I. That's our official challenge for everyone out there. Like,
if you can somehow
you can
BBM any of the three of us, then yes, you are top priority. But yeah, first comment on our YouTube video who actually has an idea, or actually has something that they wanted to say that is appropriate. I will have to point this out because I don't want any inappropriate comments, and then they expect me to like say it. But yes, if anyone has it, first commenter usually gets the first privilege, unless if it's just like a little bit of a praise or interest in the video. But yes, if you have anything to say about this, let us know. Message us on YouTube, or just keep us posted on Twitter. So yet again, guys, thank you very much for joining me for this podcast, and anyone who's listening out there, thank you for listening. Take care and goodbye.
Bye.
later, y'all.